If we do what is right now, in 1963, we must set aside substantial areas of our country for all the people who are going to live in it by the year 2000. Where 180 million Americans now live, by the year 2000, there will be 350 million of them.
Either we stop the poisoning in our air, or we become a nation in gas mass, groping our way through these dying cities and a wilderness of ghost towns that the people have evacuated.
The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
And accelerate development of technology to capture energy from the sun and the earth for this and future generations.
If we fail to act soon, we will face an economic, social, and political crisis that will threaten our free institutions.
We must and will be sensitive to the delicate balance of our ecosystems, the preservation of endangered species, and the protection of our wilderness lands.
It's been said that we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And when our children look back on this time and this place, they will be grateful.
If we fail to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases, deadly heat waves and droughts will become more frequent, coastal areas will flood, and economies will be disrupted. That is going to happen unless we act.
And here we have a serious problem. America is addicted to oil.
I'm 87 years old. I was a child during the Depression. The Great Depression had an enormous influence on the lives of all of us that experienced it. I lived in the country. I'm a country boy, small town kid. We didn't have electricity. We learned to live simply and get our sustenance from the earth. I didn't own a car until I was 27. I grew up with conservation because it was important for our lives. Then after the war, everybody thought they ought to have a chance to be rich.
There was an enormous economic boom going on after the war. There was this progress is our most important product feeling to the 1950s. And I was one of many relatively spoiled children of that compared to the people who grew up with the Depression. When I was a kid growing up in Rockford, Illinois, I was reading Outdoor Life, and I took the Conservation Pledge. I give my pledge as an American to save and faithfully to defend from waste the natural resources of my country, its soil and minerals, its forests, waters, and wildlife. And that's me at age 10 or something like that. I got rubber stamps that I put on all my books that said that. And I guess like a lot of that generation, as I saw pieces of that childhood destroyed in one way or another that you couldn't go back to, then you get that sense of angst of, well, how much of this process of loss is going to go on?
I grew up in a beautiful Midwest town. You drove around and it was a green, peaceful, relatively intact system. I really never was confronted with issues of scarcity, pollution, man's impact on the planet. These things just didn't come up for me. Those days, environmental problems didn't really impress themselves on you. It wasn't clear that we had any very serious problems.
Americans want to believe in a future that is expansive, that's better than the past. When I was a kid, the year 2000 was 40 years in the future, and the sort of thing that the futurists were all laying out was almost unimaginable. That never seemed to me to be a particularly interesting way to live. I always thought, and kind of held a mental model, that somehow we would all find a way to live in something more like a New England village. We would know our neighbors. We would have genuine say in decisions that were made that would impact our lives. This always seemed to me a far superior future.
I voted for the Interstate Highway Program, which I see now as a great mistake. I was a freshman congressman. You went along for the ride. The vision we had was superabundance. There was no discussion of how much oil we had. There was just an assumption that it would always be there, and they would always be finding more oil, and oil would be cheap. And so the automobile culture that we adopted began to gain strength. Let the trains and public transportation go. That's what we did in most parts of the country. This was the future, the individual, the automobile.
California has been the heart of much of the environmental leadership in America. Every day we see something that we grew up with our youth, that we treasured, that is lost. Southern California was a beautiful place. Small towns, orange groves, mustard fields, and then the metropolis of Los Angeles. We had the finest transportation system in the world. Electric trains, you could go anywhere.
San Bernardino to Santa Monica. My dad committed to work from South Pasadena every day of his life. We'd had steady development since the end of World War II in 1945, and by 1950, when I was up at Stanford, they had to close down high school baseball games because the air had grown so smoggy as a result of the automobiles and the vanishing of the great electric trains. What happened to Los Angeles in my lifetime was that it became one huge suburb.
Ecology means the study of organisms in combination with their environments. We take groups of organisms, put them in an environment, and try and understand what's happening. My original interest in human population developed when I was an undergraduate at Penn in the 50s. As a biologist, the thing that I saw first was when I was in high school, they were doing so much building of subdivisions for more and more people in New Jersey and spraying so much DDT around that the butterflies I was interested in studying were disappearing. That tied very directly to population, as do almost all of our other environmental problems.
I was born into a paper-making family, so my youth was surrounded by the felling of trees and by paper mills that produced vast quantities of uncontrolled sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide. I think I probably have a bit of diminished lung capacity that grew out of breathing all of that acid for all of those years. There's probably some Freudian rebellion against my father that was part of it. So I was intensely aware that there were these destructive things going on to the land around me. But I guess as I was growing up, it wasn't something that I thought of as a question. I mean, this was just progress. There's something that's much more insidious with things that are not so visible and nevertheless have dramatic impacts. Like nuclear fallout from atmospheric nuclear tests. When I was born, strontium-90 didn't exist. By the time I was a teenager, every living creature on the planet had strontium-90 in its bones or its shells. That's a fairly profound change. And we'd done it.
It felt to me like the preciousness of life was imperiled. Subconsciously, I may have understood that my way of life, you know, the sort of middle-class American way of life, was imperiled. I couldn't have articulated it then because I didn't understand all the connections. Bear in mind that as a child, I was, you know, trained to hide under my desk in the event of a nuclear explosion. Living with the possibility of the bomb is foundational to this idea that human extinction has been put within human grasp.
The mushroom cloud was the icon of my generation. That image was in every classroom I went to as a child. It was the epitome of human creation and creativity to have developed this incredibly destructive thing. And then, of course, there was the light side of the shadow. You know, there was this idea that was out there that the atom was going to be the salvation of humanity.
This was the first generation that had acquired the power of a geophysical force that could cause brand new radioactive substances to be disseminated throughout the entire planet. That could drive not just a few species, as we'd always done, but now literally thousands of species into extinction. That could change the climate.
We've been on this planet for several hundred thousands of years, and during most of that time, anybody who looked far into the future didn't have much survival value. I mean, if you're in the midst of a battle with a mammoth or something, you don't sit there and say, well, let's think about 3 years from now. You run. And so for a long period of time, the advantage went to those who focused on the immediate situation. And I think as a consequence of that, now that we are faced with issues which will really unfold over centuries, we're genetically and institutionally ill-adapted for it.
The concept that the planet is very fragile really came out of Rachel Carson's book. Silent Spring sounded the alarm that we were destroying the life support system of the planet. The book was a sensation. It was printed in over 30 languages.
Rachel Carson has to get the main credit for the modern environmental movement because she was the first one to point out one of the really serious environmental problems. That was the overuse of pesticides. It was the right moment, the right book, and the right personality. Although the pesticide industry tried to demonize her, Rachel Carson didn't demonize easily.
Unless we do bring these chemicals under better control, we are certainly headed for disaster. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment. You can't just step in with some brute force and change one thing without changing a good many others. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that we must never interfere, that we must not attempt to tilt that balance of nature in our favor. But when we do make this attempt, we must know what we're doing. We must know the consequences.
There was an ugly backlash after the book came out. The chemical industries were calling her a hysterical woman that didn't know what she was talking about.
The major claims in Miss Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, are gross distortions of the actual facts, completely unsupported by scientific experimental evidence and general practical experience in the field. Miss Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
something that we all thought of prior to her as better living through chemistry, in a sense. You're pouring this stuff on your crops and you're producing more crops, and it really was not something that you thought, my goodness, people are intentionally poisoning the environment, and that those poisons might not be as selective as they're telling us.
Rachel Carson was incredibly scrupulous in the creation of Silent Spring. She understood that we are organisms as much as the birds whose songs were being silenced. She wrote not only a tremendously informative book, but an incredibly moving book. And she did it while she was suffering from cancer.
There was a controversy that raged really until her death. It was still going on. And that was kind of sad because she was a shy person. She was not a crusader. She was a scientist.
There appears to be growing concern among scientists as to the possibility of dangerous long-range side effects from the widespread use of DDT and other pesticides.
President Kennedy's Science Advisory Group reported that Rachel Carson's method of research was sound and her findings and conclusions were generally correct. President Kennedy backed Rachel Carson.
I think particularly, of course, since Miss Carson's book, but...
and that put the chemical industry on the defensive.
I truly believe that we in this generation must come to terms with nature. And I think we're challenged, as mankind has never been challenged before, to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves.
A really profound difficulty that we confront, particularly in the West, is the degree to which people came to equate the accumulation of material goods with success and happiness. It hasn't always been like that. The things we have to do to accumulate more goods tends to deteriorate the quality of the social system. So, as we get less and less satisfaction from the social side of our lives, we naturally tend to put more and more emphasis on the accumulation of material goods.
When I was 19, I took off and hitchhiked around the world for a few years, and I was just profoundly depressed by the many ways that America was falling short of the American dream that I'd been taught in my younger years. In January of 1965, I find myself in Namibia in the middle of a desert. I was hungry, I was tired, had been alone for a couple of years, and had, in essence, sort of a vision. The things that came together in my mind at that point were the human problems we were facing and the principles of ecology that guided literally everything on Earth. Ecology is in some large measure the study of how populations obtain and use energy efficiently, energy from the sun through their food supplies. And because humans had divorced themselves in some large measure from the inflow of solar energy by tapping into fossil energy resources, we'd been able to, seemingly for a period of time, for a century or so, violate some of these basic principles of ecology And by and large, they led us into some really unfortunate consequences. The idea here is, what do you really do to try to bring the carbon cycle back into balance? It occurred to me that we need to begin to apply the principles of ecology to the way we build our cities, to the way that we manage our agricultural system, to the way that we make industrial processes. I was literally awake all night, excited with this thing, and got up the next morning knowing what I was going to do. I was going to come back to the United States. I was going to become engaged in political activity, and I was going to be trying to see if I could somehow insert this insight into the body politic.
There were no environmental laws when I became Secretary of Interior. The rivers of this country essentially were sewers. There was a smog episode in New York City that killed a large number of people. Air pollution that killed people. We made, during the 1960s, the first list of endangered species, and what was at the top of the list? The American bald eagle, our national symbol.
Like lots of others in my generation, I thought that all the beauty was going to be destroyed. I thought that cheesy suburbs would overrun the fields and the hills. It was a sense that we were finalizing our alienation from nature and poisoning the planet. And I didn't want to live in a world like that.
When I was growing up, progress was defined by growth in gross national product. That you could see the gross national product grow ever higher, at the same time that there was this growing recognition that life was, in some very important ways, getting worse as we progressed. Our air and water were polluted. Our most beautiful natural places were being destroyed. Cities are becoming increasingly unlivable. Food was becoming increasingly processed to the point where it was neither nutritious nor enjoyable, and on, all of which contributed to this sense of progress. But at the same time, people had a mounting discontent that in some sense was one of the great underlying engines of launching the environmental movement.
The environmental movement that grew out of Rachel Carson's book was built on the foundation of the conservation movement. There were big issues like preserving the Everglades and not putting an airport there. The National Wildlife Federation was right in the forefront of this. There was a big proposal for dams in the Grand Canyon. And you imagine damming the Grand Canyon? This was raised into a big national issue, particularly by the Sierra Club. And I was persuaded as Secretary of Interior that the project should be abandoned. The environmental movement enlarged the conservation movement. It enlarged it beyond concern for the management of United States resources to the future of the planet itself.
What really alarmed me about the state of the planet's ecology was a book by Paul Ehrlich on overpopulation. It just made perfect sense to me that human overpopulation was driving the degradation of the quality of life.
When I was born, there were 2 billion people on the planet. When I wrote The Population Bomb in 1968, there were 3.5 billion people on the planet. That number has now almost doubled. We're over 6.5 billion. And people say, well, population growth is slowing down. We're only going to add, if we're lucky, another 2.5 billion people. Well, 2.5 billion people is more than there were on the entire planet when I was born.
The population situation is bad beyond what any demographer even dreamed of 25 years ago. What about the resource situation in the world? Well, the most important resource to all of us, of course, is food.
When Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, came out in the late 60s, he was instantly famous. He was instantly controversial.
Sometime in the next 15 years, the end will come. And by the end, I mean an utter breakdown of the capacity of the planet to support humanity.
I'd been a student of Paul Ehrlich's at Stanford. I trusted him and liked him. I bought it completely. It was a global perspective, which was interesting because many of the things that environmentalists were doing up to then were not so global.
You can be absolutely sure that we've had it. Everybody who's looked into the overall population, resource, and environment picture comes up with the same kind of estimate of what would be required if we're to have a 50-50 chance of getting through the next couple of decades with civilization intact.
He grabbed the thorniest thistle of all, which is us, human reproduction. I was totally galvanized. And I went to my dorm room and just sort of blasted out a draft of this speech to deliver at commencement, titled, "The Future is a Cruel Hoax." It was pretty drastic rhetoric. I said, mankind's moved across the face of the earth like a great unthinking, unfeeling cancer, and that the most humane thing for me to do would be to have no children at all. I was a media figure overnight. It was personal. I said, I'm not going to have a child. This is very serious. And I was a woman saying it.
All right.
I went around and gave 80 speeches in a year.
If every student says, I'm not going to have more than 2 children, then within 5 years, the population growth curve will begin to drop. So the future is in our hands in a very, very real sense this way.
The pill had just recently become available. So this is something I can do as an act of conscience.
We had a lot of illusions about Earth. One of them was that it was basically flat and infinite with no finitude to our resources. And we had very stereotyped ideas of what the Earth looked like from space. If you look at all the images that people made before we had the photographs, almost none of them have clouds and weather and climate. There's such a thing as icons, and icons help frame people's thinking. My sense was that a photograph of Earth from space would be different in every possible way from a painting of the Earth from space. In 1966, I took some LSD on a rooftop in San Francisco. I noticed that the buildings of downtown were not parallel to one another. It was as if you were looking with a fisheye lens. They had this slightly divergent quality to them. And so basically I'm mentally elevating myself higher and higher and higher until the horizon closes around me in a circle. What I'm looking at is the surface of a sphere. I was just trying to call forth that reality. And what I thought was, taking my, 100 mics of LSD on a rooftop, I know that I'll just make a button. I come up with a phrasing that I like. Why haven't we seen a photograph of the whole Earth yet? I'll distribute the button through the world, and everybody will understand we need to see a photograph of the whole Earth. And when we do, everything will be different. So I printed up a bunch of these buttons, and I went around to various universities and sold the buttons for 25 cents a piece. I sent them to Buckminster Fuller and Marshall McLuhan and all the senators and their secretaries that I could find. I sent them to various professionals at NASA and Politburo members in Russia. I just, floated this stuff out there, see what would happen.
At that time, in the late 60s, the whole Earth catalog became kind of the Sears catalog of the Back to the Land generation with this intelligence behind it of stewards. Stewart's motto was, we are as gods, and we might as well get good at it.
The whole Earth catalog had basically appropriate technology as our contribution. Photovoltaic things that you could put on your roof that you would get 12-volt power out of. That was deemed appropriate technology. Putting something in a creek that would pump water was appropriate technology. Geodesic domes and solar equipment. Organic gardening, in that sense, was appropriate technology. People were going back to the land, back to basics, reinvent civilization, get it right this time. And the sense was that one was going to blend with nature.
The idea of going back to the land is to become more capable of providing your own subsistence and to reduce your impact and your complicity in long chains of supply. It was saying our way of life has to change. And I loved all that because it was radical.
By and large, the people who were starting rural communes, people who were going, quote, back to the land in the 1960s and on into the 70s, were pretty much liberal, educated college students. The naivete that was carted from college campuses out to these places in the bush was breathtaking. People try to garden, imagining that they could just put seeds in the ground, or we'd have a nobody's in charge, put all your money into the pot kind of social economic environment, and that would crash and burn. The women would leave, and the men would leave soon after. All of us who went out and tried to live together in totally egalitarian mode got over it, because we had our noses rubbed in our fondest fantasies. And it only took us a couple of years. And we did no great harm in the process.
It was tempting to try to throw out everything and start over. I thought about that and tried various efforts at it, lived on a commune and thought about simply retreating back to the hills, spent some time in the mountains of Virginia, way up on a mountaintop. None of that seemed to be an answer. The world around us is pretty much the world we're going to have. We're either going to work with that or we're going to lose.
One peculiarity of the counterculture in the 60s was that it was inherently really anti-technology. I think it thought technology came from government, it came from corporations, and we're going back to basics. We don't need technology. Except our hi-fis, of course, and our drugs. And those could be as, the more technically refined those were, the better. But by and large, technology was supposed to be bad. So much of the counterculture disapproved of the space program. It was military guys with crew cuts. It was the government wasting money. Let's take care of things here on Earth before we leave it. All of this kind of rhetoric was out there, except for one guy, Jacques Cousteau, the oceans guy. He had a better sense of the sphericity of the Earth probably than any other surface-bound person at that time. What he knew was that the oceans, 2/3, 3/4 of the planet, you could not monitor, and yet terrible things were happening to it. So his sense was that you had to have satellite imagery and people looking down on the Earth from outside in order to protect the oceans. He just said, we've got to get out there. Identified with it. The whole world identified with it. And the whole world was proud of it. Once you got pride, I learned this in the Army, a whole bunch of things that seemed impossible start to seem not only possible, but let's get on with it. There was a sense of engineering accomplishment of being able to set a damn near impossible goal and then just haul off and do it.
As an astronaut, I was really emotionally invested in what was happening with the planet. Being who I was, and not just blasting my little pink body up into space, but being able to look back with my human eyes and my brain and my heart and see this planet below me, to me, you know, technology has clearly both good sides and bad sides. It's how one uses it.
Let's do it, isn't it? Yeah, looks like it.
Apollo 9 was the first flight that flew the lunar module, and I was the first lunar module pilot. And I also went outside the lunar module, and it would be the first time that a human being went outside a spacecraft without an umbilical.
Okay. Proceeding on out.
Dave's in the command module, hanging out the hatch with a movie camera, when all of a sudden he says, hey, hold on, my camera just jammed.
It's ripped out of it's probably mine.
So Jim says, well, I'll give you 5 minutes. Rusty, just stay right there. I'm just floating there, almost as if I'm naked in space. And all this stuff starts coming into my mind. I'm here because life has evolved on this planet. We've developed brains which enable us to invent machines. In combination with those machines, we're able to extend our environment. And here I am on the frontier of this evolutionary process. What am I? I'm a representative of life moving out into the universe. So the idea of Mother Earth, that phrase has real meaning. From the outside, you can look back. The child now sees its mother. We human beings, we this life form on this incredible planet, just coated with life. Where are we going?
Photographs of the Earth from space were a different kind of mirror than we had ever looked in before. It flips you from the world that we're in to a planet that we're on.
The image, I think, was maybe the most reproduced image in American history. We suddenly realized that the Earth was a very small thing. Much as if you live on an island, you are much more acutely aware of the limitations on your resources and on your ability to pollute. That photograph of the Earth and this vast sea of space, that did pretty much the same thing for the whole planet.
If the people really understood that in the lifetime of their children, they're going to have destroyed the quality of the air and the water all over the world, and perhaps made the globe unlivable in a half century, they'd do something about it. But this is not well understood.
Senator Gaylord Nelson was one of my very best friends. He was a great governor of Wisconsin, and he was a great conservationist. He was the one that said, well, why not have teach-ins about the environment all over the country? And this is what became the first Earth Day in 1970.
Gaylord cared passionately about conservation issues throughout his entire career.
In efficient, clean, cheap mass transportation, which is what this country must come to.
He had decided to set up a steering committee and actually make this begin to happen. He'd enlisted already Pete McCloskey, a Republican congressman from California who was an ardent environmentalist, to co-chair it with him.
The preservation of the environment is going to have to be a very top item. For that reason, I just delighted to support it.
And the Republican Party in my lifetime had been an environmental party. But man, by 1970, it was hard to find Republicans that put the environment anywhere in their top 5 list of priorities. But Gaylord, he wanted it to be bipartisan. So he said, Pete, would you be co-chairman? Would I be co-chairman? It meant everything that I wanted to do in the world. So I think it was in December, January 1970, we hired Dennis Hayes to be the director. And Dennis comes to Washington with about 20 or 30 kids that are about 18 to 22, the oldest. And they send out newsletters all over the country to every student body present, 10,000 high schools, a couple of thousand colleges. Would you like to have an Earth Day on April 22nd?
What we were trying to do was to create a brand new public consciousness that would cause the rules of the game to change. It was somewhat ironic for something called Earth Day to be entirely focused on the United States. But remember, we had virtually no money. We had incredible aspirations, but there was no World Wide Web. There was no internet, there were no blogs, there was no email, there was no instant messaging, there was none of the kind of web activism that is possible today. The newsletters that were sent to people across the country were all printed for us for free by the United Auto Workers. The United Auto Workers were the largest single contributors, financially and otherwise, to Earth Day.
Ever noticed that even on a clear day in New York, there's a dark cloud hanging over your head? Soot and carbon. Ever take a good look at the Hudson River? How'd you like to drink it? Half the sun in New York is cut out by the carbon from cars. Pollution comes right through your air conditioner, and you inhale more than a pack a day, even if you don't smoke. And there are already more rats in New York than people. By 1980, you're probably going to need a gas mask and a flashlight to get to the office. There won't be any birds or bees or trees. Unless we stop what we're doing, we're going to kill ourselves. April 22nd is Earth Day. It can be the beginning of the end of pollution, or the beginning of the end.
Mr. McCloskey, isn't this just really a mask to cover up the major problems of Vietnam and civil rights in this country?
Well, won't this, in fact, deflect people from Vietnam as a cause?
Why an environmental teach-in? Now, what's the point of putting more money down the drain in this kind of stuff?
That might involve cutting back on things like air conditioning.
Are you going to get liberal support for this? How will you deal, in effect, with the women's liberation movements?
Is there any concern in your mind that this might just be a fad? There are practically no black people involved.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us here today on Face the Nation.
By and large, we created a juggernaut that everybody was willing to embrace, at least stylistically and superficially, though a great many of them did not begin to understand the depth of the changes that we were seeking. So we were not particularly shocked by the fact that in his 1970 State of the Union speech, Nixon brought up environmental issues.
Restoring nature to its natural state is a cause beyond party and beyond factions. It has become a common cause of all the people of this country. It is a cause of particular concern to young Americans, because they, more than we, will reap the grim consequences of our failure to act on programs which are needed now if we are to prevent disaster later.
I know from some of his aides I talked to, there was a big argument, and they said, look, this is a powerful movement, and it's going to get more powerful. There's an Earth Day coming up in a few weeks, proclaim that you want the 1970s to be the environmental decade. Nixon did it.
The Earth Day offices were wiretapped by the FBI. And interestingly, also by military intelligence. Lord knows what they thought we were doing.
Do you consider yourselves revolutionaries? Is this a revolutionary movement?
What are you talking about? A new form of government? A new religion? What are you talking about? What are your
And it was wild and exciting and out of control, and the sort of thing that lets you know that you've really got something big happening.
The White House invited the national organizers of Earth Day to drop by for a chat. They refused. Christopher Demuth, the president's 23-year-old assistant for environmental affairs, blames Dennis Hayes, the national coordinator of Earth Day, saying that Hayes was more interested in an anti-Nixon publicity stance than in ensuring that the observance was truly nonpartisan.
At the time that it all happened, I think Nixon, who by all accounts did not have an environmental nerve ending anywhere in his body, viewed this as a political chess move.
We'll try to play all cameras. I'll play a little bit moving around here as we go along, because you'll use it. Okay. I have sent to the Congress today a sweeping set of proposals to clean up our nation's air and water. This is the most far-reaching and comprehensive message on conservation and restoration of our natural resources ever submitted to the Congress by a President of the United States. We are taking these actions not in some distant future, but now, because we know that it is now or never.
I began Earth Day with a sunrise ceremony in Washington, D.C. Then I flew up to New York. Mayor Lindsay had shut down Fifth Avenue, and we basically filled it all up. The fact that we managed to have our largest event in what was then the center of all media coverage was advantageous.
Earth Day demonstrations began in practically every city and town in the United States this morning, the first massive nationwide protest against the pollution of the environment. In Washington, there was an awesome Earth Day warning from a government scientist. Dr. J. Murray Mitchell said pollution and overpollution, unless checked, could so warm the Earth in 200 years as to create a greenhouse effect, melting the Arctic ice cap and flooding vast areas of the world.
Nationally, Earth Day was the largest demonstration ever in American history. Some events had 500,000 people in them, and we had an estimated 20 million across the country.
Some quarters saw more than coincidence in the fact that Earth Day occurred on the 100th anniversary of the birth of Lenin, the father of Soviet communism. The Comptroller General of Georgia, James Bentley, sent out $1,600 worth of telegrams warning that Earth Day might be a communist plot.
There were certainly people who had their pet causes. Some pounded vehicles apart with sledgehammers as a protest against the internal combustion engine. Others wore gas masks to protest air pollution. But also there was an almost celebratory thing, as though suddenly we were awakening to a new set of opportunities.
They are talking about emission control devices on automobiles, while we are talking about bans on automobiles. We are challenging the ethics of a society that, with only 6% of the world's population, accounts for more than half of its utilization of resources. Our country is stealing from the poorer countries of the world and from generations as yet unborn.
To me, Earth Day was life-changing. There were, around the country, millions of people engaging in some act of caring for the Earth. I realized that there was a massive group of people who cared very deeply about the Earth, and if organized, could be a viable political movement. At that point, I ceased to be an anti-war activist and became an environmentalist.
Save our Earth! 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 Save our Earth!
I've been in 3 of these gatherings today. And let me say this to you, that you can't stand in front of a group like this without feeling the power which can flow from it. And so what we must do is to make every day Earth Day.
It was from Washington that 25-year-old Dennis Hayes started to organize this nationwide thing, and it is here he has returned tonight to say that this thing is now a movement, and like Vietnam, an anti-establishment movement.
We are systematically destroying our land, our streams, and our seas. We fall our
It was a
air,
huge, high adrenaline effort that, in the end, genuinely changed things. Before, there were people that opposed freeways, there were people that opposed clear-cutting, there were people worried about pesticides. They didn't think of themselves as having anything in common. After Earth Day, they were all part of an environmental movement.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country. And some people don't. People start pollution. People can stop it.
Immediately after Earth Day, we chose to get involved in something that we really hadn't paid any attention to before Earth Day: organized formal politics, elections. We came up with a campaign called the Dirty Dozen that targeted 12 members of Congress with terrible environmental records.
The Dirty Dozen are E. Ross Adair of Indiana, William Ayers of Ohio, William Cowger of Kentucky, David Dennis of Indiana, George Fallon of Maryland, John Kyle of Iowa, Earl Landgrebe of Indiana, Odin Langen of Minnesota, Byron Rogers of Colorado, Henry Schatterberg of Wisconsin, Lawrence Wynn of Kansas, and Roger Zion of Indiana.
We beat 7 of the 12 members of the Dirty Dozen, including the chairman of the House Public Works Committee, a guy named George Fallon out of Baltimore, who was funding all kinds of environmental monsters. People were saying, "You took out George Fallon?" I mean, he was clearly one of the 3 or 4 most powerful members of Congress.
And when Congress reconvened in January, everybody said, "I'm now an environmentalist." I mean, there was a force out there that had taken out 7 incumbents.
We propose the establishment of a joint House-Senate Committee on the Environment to expand the congressional capacity to deal with environmental...
The frightening variety of hazards and environmental offenses over which we have had little, up to this time, a little in the way of control.
President Nixon sent this report to Congress today, an assessment of the nation's environmental problems and ideas on how to solve them. He sounded the familiar warning of ecological disaster, but counseled against panic or hysteria.
In the next 4 years, 71 through 74, we passed clean water, clean air, endangered species, estuarine protection, coastal zone protection, marine mammal protection. And a lot of that went through my little subcommittee.
I think President Nixon was looking forward to the next election. Well, was he going to veto this Clean Air, Clean Water bill? No. He signed it with a flourish. And then proposed the creation of what is now still the Environmental Protection Agency to enforce these pollution laws. We got environmental impact statements. You had to look at the downside as well as the upside of any technological project. That was revolutionary because it gave people the power to challenge unlimited technological growth. Nixon deserves credit for what he did, and I'm not sure he fully understood it, but he got behind it.
In the 70s, in the United States, we did clean up quite a few lakes, and we did reduce the air pollution in quite a few cities. But there was essentially no progress on the global problems. Things like climate change, depletion of the marine fisheries, the ocean fisheries, population growth, and so forth. There has always been the notion that we will be able to sustain our current trajectory in living standards and material consumption and so, and moreover, that all the poor people in the world are going to be able to catch up with us. The entire discipline of economics, macroeconomics, is based on the assumption that output is going to continue to grow, living standards are going to continue to grow, and so forth.
The economy can't keep growing forever. The idea that somehow the gross domestic product of the United States should double in the next 50 or 100 years or something is just nutty. Economists have clearly shown that once you have your basic needs fulfilled, that further economic growth and consumption doesn't supply any more satisfaction. Americans aren't any happier today or more satisfied than they were in 1950, despite the growth we've had in our economy.
Most of us don't have an experience of growth the way it's impacting on the planet, because you get up every morning and look around, and it seems to be pretty much the same as it was yesterday. Our species just naturally tends to assume that change happens more or less linearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like that. But in fact, the problems that are causing environmental deterioration arise out of exponential growth, which is where instead of going up by a constant amount over some time period, it goes up by a percentage over some time period. I've tried to illustrate what this means with a very simple example. I bring out a tablecloth. I show it to everybody. I fold it 4 times. So I'm doubling the thickness of the tablecloth 4 times. And I let everybody see it, and I say, suppose that that is ½ an inch thick. Not much. If I were to fold it another 15, 16 times, how thick would it be? Now, I can't actually, but suppose I could do that. When you keep doubling the tablecloth, of course, it's growing exponentially. And after 21 folds, it'll be about a mile thick. If I double it another 5 or 6 times, it extends out past the edge of space. Continuing that process rather quickly gives you amazingly big numbers. With just 39 folds, it's already shooting past the moon. That's how quickly you get to very large numbers when a process grows exponentially. Our book, Limits to Growth, was the first concrete effort using a computer to look at trends that unfold over decades, even a century. We were trying to understand long-term physical demands on the planet. And in the 70s, we were thinking that probably in the period 2010 to 2030 was when the planet would start to encounter limits. And that when you hit the limits, the tendency is to overshoot them and collapse, not to even out in a nice, orderly fashion. The book was officially released in March of 1972, and the inaugural event was a press conference in Washington, D.C.
To have this opportunity.
The book was rather quickly translated into 35 languages and sold millions. It was a phenomenon.
Here is what Dr. Meadows' computer shows. Since the year 1900, the Earth's resources, there at the top of the chart, have been steadily used up as population, food consumption, and production of goods have soared. Ahead of us, sometime after the year 2000, this computer study foresees calamity. Resources drop more steeply, and food and production follow suit. Population continues to expand for perhaps one more generation, then collapses calamitously as deprivation takes hold.
I remember the first time I saw that NASA picture of Earth taken over the moon. That picture somehow had the capacity to just wrench your mind around so you thought about things in a different way. Our curves to debt for a lot of people. For the first time, they could start to see the future consequences of what they were doing now, and for many people, that was really shocking.
I went to the first presentation. I thought it was potent and powerful. The thesis that growth had to be limited to preserve the quality of the environment, the quality of life. It's a thesis, a theme that I still agree with today. There are limits to growth, and we're bumping against them right now.
Civilizations have crashed repeatedly in the past. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the classic Maya, Greek civilization, and so on. The thing that's so scary today is that we have, for the first time, a global civilization that is doing what many of those other ones did, building a huge population and abusing its environment without any thought to the consequences.
There can be no doubt what one subject has aroused most controversy among scientists during the past 12 months. I mean, of course, the prospect of doom for mankind because of pollution, overpopulation, overuse of resources, what has been called the eco-crisis.
Well, I think that the conclusions of this study are completely wrong. If you check...
There were various efforts to discredit Limits to Growth and to discredit Paul Ehrlich's work. And indeed, much of what they said could come to pass has not come to pass. Well, does that mean they're wrong? No, what it means is all we've done is push off these challenges that they very rightly identified.
Would you welcome Dr. Paul Ehrlich? Nice to see you again.
It's nice to be back, as always.
You know, you've been on our show a half a dozen times or so, and I remember the first time you were on the show, we talked about the population bomb, and we talked about the geometric progression of the number of people that are accruing to this planet every day. And I remember at that time that you said, and many other population biologists and sociologists said, that the time is going to come when people are going to have a rude awakening around the world, and especially in the United States, where they've been used to so much affluence, where we're going to run out. It's going to come to a head sooner or later, because the resources of the world are not finite, and all of a sudden now, people, for I think one of the first times in history in this country, really realize it's happening.
All right, finish. No more gas. How much bread? Let's go. No gas. Let's go. I'm sorry. No more gas. 3,000 gallons lasts about 2 hours.
As America has grown and prospered in recent years, our energy demands have begun to exceed available supplies. Unfortunately, our expectations for this winter have now been sharply altered by the recent conflict in the Middle East. Because of that war, most of the Middle Eastern oil producers have reduced overall production and cut off their shipments of oil to the United States.
King Faisal of Saudi Arabia announced an embargo of oil to the United States, which was quickly then embraced by the other Arab members of OPEC, and so it became the quote-unquote Arab oil embargo. Well, at that point cost $4 a barrel. It's hard to remember that America was really built on oil that cost between $2 and $4 a barrel. The price rapidly shot up, getting up over $16 a barrel, a 400% increase. The price of gasoline quadrupled within just 2 months. There was a degree of desperation because of shortages of supplies. People couldn't get gasoline. Gas lines would stretch on for half a mile sometimes. We were driving these big cars, absolutely reliant upon them, and you couldn't find gasoline. So they started rationing.
I can't see the United States running out of anything, but maybe that's, I'm prejudiced that way. I just can't, I think the United States should be able to have plenty of anything.
The United States recognized for the first time that our standard of living could be held hostage by people halfway around the world. With good policy, this could have been the initiation of a transition to a renewable society. That in itself was not a new concept. In the early 1950s, a government commission called the Paley Commission urged a transition as rapidly as possible to renewable energy, to solar energy, to energy efficiency, as a matter of national security. Of course, we ignored them.
The United States of America, as the greatest industrial power of the world, with 7% of the world's people, and using 30% of the world's energy, shouldn't have to depend on any other country for energy that provides our jobs and our transportations and our light and our heat. We can become self-sufficient. This is a great project, and I'm going to push it. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I guess that's the end.
I remember when Nixon stood up and announced Project Independence. Every president after him announced some sort of energy independent program. And of course, they all had more or less the same result. But these were peripheral responses. They didn't get to the heart of it, and never did.
The energy market at that time was a market that was a combination of guaranteed monopolies, cartels, and insurance and price subsidies, favoring the largest, the most powerful, the most wealthy, and I will say the most ruthless corporations in America. And they had just a stranglehold on Congress. Electric utilities were the largest monopolists in the country. There was only one way to buy power. So, historically, you have one set of hugely powerful interests defending their preeminence, and on the other hand, a bunch of solar entrepreneurs operating out of their garages with virtually nothing. It's like me going into the boxing ring with Muhammad Ali. It's just not a contest.
It's done.
Development and economic progress has been at the heart of the election of congressmen. And there's generally been a lot more money from the energy companies and the developers. So the environmental movement may be viewed by most of the public as important, but to the politician who's elected, who gives the money? There's no benefit to them in looking at the solution of long-range problems like global warming or the conservation of energy. It's a short-term problem that he's got to address to get reelected. Follow the money.
It's not a fad. The concern for environment is a very...
Many of us believed if you just elected the right people and they passed the right laws, if you could bring a case to court and get a ruling, then everybody would have to be good. Well, no. People said, you can't make me do anything. And that, in part, set up a conflict that to some extent endures to this day.
A case in point in the 60s and 70s was people who went to logging areas. City people went and shook their fingers at the loggers and said, stop clear cutting. And the loggers looked at these folks. I was a logger, so I'm on their side on this one. They just said, you're not from here. You don't know what you're talking about. And your entire effort seems to be making sure that my livelihood goes away. Why don't you just go away?
Just look around. All the land's going into parks, and if it all goes into parks, then we just won't have no timber, and jobs will go, housing will go sky high. This area will become practically a ghost town.
And so as a result, what you got was, instead of some engagement that might have led to better forest practices right away, you got a standoff that lasted decades. Then you have to ask yourself, is the thing that we want to make a big fuss and feel righteous, or is the thing that we want better forest practices? Which is a completely arguable thing for people who would not only like to keep their job as loggers, but to have these rural communities keep going, because logging is what they do. Sustainable logging looks to them like a good thing, put in those terms. But put in the terms of, stop what you're doing, you bad person you, that doesn't fly.
The environmental movement was becoming more professionalized and Washington-centric. And to a certain extent, the environmental movement developed some clout through the big national organizations, but it also became susceptible to being overpowered by bigger organizations with deeper pockets.
I began to recognize that much of what the early environmental movement was trying to do, to litigate, to legislate, to lobby in a top-down fashion, could buy time, it could hold off the worst, but it could never implement true sustainability.
A whole cadre of people that I hung out with who wanted to solve problems right now directly with minimal resources and maximum ingenuity. We imagined that we were outlaw designers. We had a sense that there were design solutions that could be brought to bear on everything from, say, solar technology to energy conservation and efficiency. We wanted to take the engineering approach and say, let's just fix that. There's not a political fix for it, but there is a technological fix for it. Just do it. Don't try to change human nature. It's not going to change. Don't try to change politics. It's too clueless. You can change technology, and that will fix things. Human nature can stay right where it is. The politics can catch on 20 years later, but meanwhile, you fixed the problem.
Many large American companies had within them individuals and small groups desperate to innovate in the same way. For example, since the 60s, there were people within General Motors, I know I've talked to them, who were designing super efficient cars with technologies like electricity and hybrid electric or even hydrogen. And yet senior management, I think, had a lack of imagination and a resistance to change. There was a sense that if you just keep doing what you've always done, you're safe.
Probably the biggest shift in perspective I've ever had was going from being a somewhat libertarian, grassroots, fringy outsider to working in the center of power in California, which is the governor's office, for a guy who was exactly my age, who's now elected governor of the state, who's appointing my friends to various positions of power.
Well, I'm an activist. I think when we have a problem like air pollution or kids who can't read, we do something about it. Instead of sitting around just talking, I think we ought to do whatever the governmental process can accomplish within the limits of the budget.
Governor Brown had a Office of Appropriate Technology, which I wound up being part of. We brought in people like the astronaut Rusty Schweikert, who was totally in a countercultural frame of reference, even though he was an astronaut.
At that time, I was growing a mustache and growing my hair long, and so, I was the astronaut hippie. Well, Jerry Brown, here he is, a student of Rachel Carson and people like Paul Ehrlich and, everybody who's part of this revolution.
My principles are simple. Protect the earth, serve the people, and explore the universe.
So I'm among friends. I ultimately became the chairman of the California Energy Commission. Fits right in. I mean, the biggest impact on the environment is the way in which we use energy. The California Energy Commission led the way into that revolution in improving the efficiency with which we control and use and generate energy.
The Department of Energy in California has been the most intelligent, energy-conserving, I think, governmental body probably in the world. They set in motion the ability for people who had solar collectors or wind generators to run their meter backwards and put their locally made electricity back into the grid and get paid for it. Very early on, this is mid-1970s.
Jimmy Carter had a terrific energy policy that had a goal of getting at least 20% of the nation's energy from renewable energy resources by the year 2000, and a series of proposed policies that, had they been implemented, actually would have gotten us there. He had solar water heaters installed on the White House roof.
A generation from now, this solar heater can either be a curiosity
a museum piece, an example of a road not taken, or it can be just a small part of one of the greatest ventures ever undertaken by the American people.
He gave me the best job of my life running the Federal Solar Energy Research Institute, and a budget that increased and doubled every year that I was there, and the opportunity to really do some important things.
The energy crisis has not yet overwhelmed us, but it will if we do not act quickly. It's a problem that we will not be able to solve in the next few years, and it's likely to get progressively worse through the rest of this century. We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources. By acting now, we can control our future instead of letting the future control us.
Carter, I think, made a fundamental mistake, which was that he saw the transition as one of constraint and as one of privation and of giving up and of lowered lifestyle.
In a period from 1973 to 1980, the price of oil went from $4 a barrel to $30 a barrel. And that clearly was enough to cause the public to support things like fuel efficiency standards for automobiles and other things that would have been inconceivable unless you'd had a crisis.
I'm Jack Lemmon for the Sierra Club. America's energy crisis is much more than just a fuel shortage.
Believe me, today we all have to do our bit to conserve energy. It just can't be wasted.
You know, at the rate the world is using its oil, we'd have to discover a new Alaska or Texas every 6 months.
The energy problems we face are real and they're serious, and they're not going to get any better unless we all help.
Energy conservation is not just a Band-Aid solution. It is the only means that we have to keep our economy and environment healthy.
They tell us we must learn to live with less and teach our children that their lives will be less full and prosperous than ours have been. That the America of the coming years will be a place where, because of our past excesses, it will be impossible to dream and make those dreams come true. I don't believe that, and I don't believe you do either. That's why I'm seeking the presidency. I cannot and will not stand by and see this great country destroy itself. Our leaders attempt to blame their failures on circumstances beyond their control, on false estimates by unknown, unidentifiable experts who rewrite modern history in an attempt to convince us our high standard of living, the result of thrift and hard work, is somehow selfish extravagance, which we must renounce as we join in sharing scarcity.
I'm much more aware now than I was earlier of the role of personalities. Who you elect as President of the United States, and frankly President of a dozen other countries, really matters. With the right president and the right policies queued up and ready to be put into place, we could have done something significant. It was a major failure of my generation that we didn't get that done.
There you go again.
For reasons that I just cannot begin to comprehend, Reagan did his very best to completely shut down the renewable energy effort. In the instance of the institute that I led, he reduced our budget by more than 80%, fired half of the staff, and fired all of our contractors, 2 of whom subsequently went on to win Nobel Prizes. It was just devastating. But for 1 year, we did have within it an element of a very good energy policy.
It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were?
The Reagan White House has finally dismantled the last vestiges of the Carter administration. Workmen have now taken down the solar water heating system installed on the White House roof in 1979.
we lost 30 years. We lost 30 years because both sides ossified into their ideologies. And if we've learned anything, it's that we're in this together. We still have a lot of options if we haven't passed a tipping point. And this is where the science starts getting a little scary.
No external force is imposing these environmental problems on us. They have arisen because every morning 6 billion people get up and have breakfast and go to work and do their thing and come home at night. Environmental problems emerge out of daily life, and the solutions for the environmental problems are also rooted in daily life. We need 6 billion people to get up and have a different consciousness and do things differently. Is that realistic? Probably not. But it's at least the hope or the belief I have, which has been able to sustain 35 years of work on this effort, and it's the one I'll keep for the next 10 or 20 years, as long as I'm able to keep working.
Well, I've always been call myself a troubled optimist. I'm hopeful for the future, despite the recent past, in the sense that I believe that you owe a responsibility to your children, your grandchildren, and their children. That's an important concept of the environmental movement that will always be there.
While we're deeply engrossed with all of our little weekly issues, if we deal with them in this larger perspective, we're engaging a set of activities which go way beyond an individual lifespan, way beyond children, grandchildren, way beyond parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, to the whole frame of at least human civilizational life. Once you get comfortable with that, then you can start to, go further out still to 3.5 billion years back of life on Earth, and maybe we'll do another 3.5 billion years. That's pretty interesting to try to hold in your mind. And once you've held it in your mind, what do you do on Monday?
Hello, I'm Ray Suarez from the PBS NewsHour. Now you've had a chance to see the American Experience film Earth Days. We thought we'd spend a few minutes taking a look at where the environmental movement finds itself today and where it may be heading. And joining me for that are Dennis Hayes, National Coordinator of the original 1970 Earth Day. He's now president of the Bullet Foundation, a nonprofit organization that supports environmental projects in the Pacific Northwest. Paul Hawken, an entrepreneur who's started ecological businesses. He's the author of several books, including The Ecology of Commerce. James Rogers, president and CEO of Duke Energy, one of the largest electric power companies in the U.S., and Elizabeth Kolbert, a staff writer for The New Yorker who covers environmental issues. Jim Rogers, let me start with you. We've just come to the end of a lengthy documentary that showed environmentalists pitted against industry. Now, fast forward 40 years, are the two still sitting across a table from each other, or have the terms of the conversation changed?
I think they've changed dramatically. What we've been able to do is to collaborate and work with environmentalists to find the way forward, where we can achieve our environmental goals for our country as well as our economic goals going forward.
Are you living in a different time, almost the way we divide time earlier in history, BED and AED, before Earth Day and after Earth Day? Does American industry find itself in a different world now that there's an EPA, a Clean Water Act, a Clean Air Act?
I think where we find ourselves is that we're a power company that provides affordable, reliable, clean electricity 24/7. What we recognize is that we need a roadmap because we will have to retire and replace every one of our power plants by 2050. So we've been advocates for regulation of carbon, to get clear regulations with respect to coal plants and the pollutants from coal plants, because at the end of the day, we need a clear roadmap where we can go to work and solve the problem.
Did you succeed too well, Dennis Hayes? I mean, are there a lot of Americans who think, well, look, I don't see the air anymore. I let my kids swim in the local park's body of water. We've done the hard, bad things that we needed to do, and now I can enjoy myself.
We succeeded pretty well on a number of local, state, and national issues. In fact, with the wave of legislation that passed between 1970 and 73, and that has been updated occasionally since then, we've sent several $1 trillion in directions that they otherwise wouldn't have flowed, and the American health and well-being is greatly benefited by that. Where we have not been so successful is dealing with environmental issues that are global in nature. National boundaries have proven to be an almost, with the exception of the ozone layer, an almost insurmountable problem for us as national interests get in the way of global interests.
So, Elizabeth Kolbert, where does the environmental movement go now?
Well, that's sort of the question of the decade, or perhaps the question of the century, to be honest. I think that the point that Dennis raises is really pertinent. We are facing increasingly problems that can only be solved on a global level. And so that really leaves, the environmental movement, even the national environmental movement here in the States, at a bit of an impasse, I think.
And searching for new dragons to slay, searching for a new organizing principle?
Well, I think that was very moving to watch that film for me, as someone who was a kid during the first Earth Day, to see all that energy out on the streets. And I think it's been a long time since we've seen that much energy out on the street. Meanwhile, we've seen the challenges that we're facing in terms of problems like global warming and ocean acidification just really take almost a quantum leap in difficulty in terms of solving.
Paul Hawken, you heard Jim Rogers earlier talk about the way the terms of engagement have changed. Do environmentally active people think already at the beginning of the debate that they understand that business has to make money, pay wages, invest, and all those component parts of keeping a business solvent and going forward?
Well, Ray, one of the things that's happened with the environmental movement is that it's not on the streets so much.
It's in boardrooms, it's in companies, it's everywhere. It's permeated every institution in the world. And so the lack of activity in the streets shouldn't be seen as a softening or as a weakening of the environmental movement. It's just it's been so successful that it goes everywhere. And one place it certainly has gone is in major corporations. And I don't think there's a responsible major corporation in the world today that doesn't take climate change and all environmental issues very seriously. Some more effectively than others, of course, and some have the kind of leadership you see in Duke Energy. But there is no question that business is now on top of this issue.
So you're saying they've already absorbed the values of the movement that Dennis Hayes was leading 40 years ago?
I'm not sure that they've completely absorbed the values, but they're certainly becoming, there's a level of literacy in the business world that there just simply wasn't there even 10 years ago, certainly not 30, 40 years ago. And that literacy is translating itself into innovation, into new policy instruments, and even into situations where you have companies like Duke lobbying the government for pro-environmental legislation as opposed to to trying to prevent it.
Jim Rogers, you heard Dennis Hayes talk about how this has to go international. I guess your company can't be green in one country either, can it?
No, it can't. In fact, this has to be at the core of your business going forward. We have been very active at working with environmentalists, NGOs, not just in the U.S., but around the world. I had the opportunity to be at Copenhagen in December, and it was an important step on the way to achieving a worldwide accord with respect to carbon.
But people were pretty disappointed. Well, many people were pretty disappointed with the outcome of Copenhagen. Is this part of the growing pains of a 21st century approach toward the environment?
I think there's positives in Copenhagen. The problem is people went into it with very high expectations. But think about this. For the first time, we had almost 100 leaders from around the world there to talk about this. Leaders of the countries. We had the Copenhagen Accord. We had the BRIC countries breaking from the 77 countries and saying we're prepared to put certain targets and goals on the table going forward. So I think we need to say the glass is half full, not half empty, but we still have a long way to go to fill it up.
Dennis Hayes, is it hard to scale up to a global climate change conversation, in part because the effects are said to be so far in the future and so hard to feel and see right now?
Well, I think you can see a great many effects right now, and although we've had a few emails that I wish hadn't been sent, the broad consensus within the scientific community, every national scientific body in the world is on record as being serious that man is changing this. And we have gone global with the issue. Earth Day will be in 191 countries this year. And we're also going to be back out in the streets. In the mall in Washington, D.C. on April 25th, we're going to have probably the largest climate rally that has ever been held in the world. And there will be a great many things for the entire previous week, because although Jim is right, the glass can either be partly full or partly empty. I think 30 years after the National Academy of Sciences said, we know enough now to start moving on climate change, it really is time to start moving. We've got to do something to jar our Congress out of inertia, or else our ability to lead the world and the ability of the rest of the world to take initiatives simply won't come together. We have to be there as the largest emitter, or one of the two largest emitters.
Elizabeth Kolbert, you hear a sense of movement, of progress from Dennis Hayes, but you sound like you're not as optimistic as he is about the state of play.
There was a lot of momentum going into Copenhagen, but I really think, I guess I have to disagree with Jim and to a certain extent with Dennis. When you see what came out of Copenhagen, it was really completely incommensurate with what everybody knows to be the scale of the problem. So I think it's pretty hard to come out of something like that. And as I said, there was a lot of energy and commitment. And as was mentioned, a lot of world leaders actually did show up in Copenhagen. But the documents that came out of it, they weren't even adequate, to meet the relatively, low targets that they had set for themselves. So what came out of there was really, a rhetoric not matched by any action so far.
So, Paul Hawken, what's the next act for the environmental movement when you look out at the coming decade?
I think the interesting thing is that there's hundreds of cities in the world that are doing what the national leaders could not agree upon in Copenhagen. Now, what you're seeing is a rising up from the bottom, from the grassroots and the regions and from the states of the world to really vigorously and aggressively adopt standards on terms of carbon emissions and other environmental issues that national leaders cannot agree upon. So I think what you're seeing is going to be a kind of a mashup between business, between NGOs, civil society, and local and regional governance to really tackle these issues that seem to be paralyzed on an international level.
Paul Hawken, Elizabeth Kolbert, Dennis Hayes, Jim Rogers, thanks to you all. You'll find lots more about Earth Day, the American Experience, and the PBS NewsHour at pbs.org. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for watching.